Hello everybody, this is a video that contains a snippet from a stream I just did, and it basically talks about some changes I made to the Ron's Help deck. Now, in the heat of the moment, I actually forgot some pieces of this, so I thought I'd mention them before we get started. And that, what I forgot mainly is the cards that were removed, but also one of the cards that were added. So what was removed was the 2 copies of Entrancing Enchantments. So basically, when I was playing the card on the last stream, I found that there were too many tutoring cards in the deck. I didn't really need to use them all, or want to use them all. So it seemed like there were other cards that could be more useful. So I'm trying out cutting these. And in the same vein, I'm cutting the Gringotts Vault keys that we were playing 2 copies before. And same thing with Entrancing Enchantments, 2 copies. So that's in total 4 copies. So cutting the Gringotts Vault key as well, that allowed us to search our deck for any card. That's another thing that it seemed like we didn't really need it. And the third thing we're cutting is our 2 copies of Hover Charm. This one may be a bit more questionable. The logic in the deck is that the Muffling Draught that I will talk about in the video later is basically gonna provide the counterplay that we wanted Hover Charm to provide against character decks. So we're sort of replacing it with a different plan. The last thing we cut was just 1 copy of, actually we already have it down here, 1 copy of Chocolate Frogs. So now we're only playing 3 copies. So we're still playing some of the tutor spells, but we probably don't need to be playing 4 of them. But playing some amount is important so that we can still easily get Snape that provides us the potions power that we need. The last change that I didn't mention on stream when talking about the changes was that I added 1 more copy of Hannah Abbott. It will become apparent when you see the rest of the video why, but apart from the stuff I talk about there, she can help us get combo pieces back and makes the combo easier. So I feel like it makes sense, especially when we have fewer tutors, to play more copies of her, because drawing 1 copy at some point is really important. So without further ado, let's get into the snippet from the stream, and thank you for watching. Now I want to for the next little section of the stream, I wanted to give a little bit of an update on the Ron's Help deck that it was on the last stream, and also I put a deck tech video on the channel for it if you want to check out the deck in detail. I wanted to talk about some changes that were made to it and why, and also talk about a card that's potentially broken or problematic for the game. So what I found when I was playing before was not on stream, but when we were testing this, we found that the Ron Weasley deck, it was a bit weak to the McGonagall deck, because it was easy for McGonagall to disrupt Ginny, getting rid of Ginny. And even when we got Ginny rolling, it was still difficult because it was hard to set up a board state where we could play 3 cards in 1 turn that were part of the kill combo. He could play a card like Defendo, for example. Where is it? Yeah, there it is. To get rid of the one shop, and also Scribbly Force that you just saw in the game where I played the deboning deck. So it seems like, and also picking on Neville was difficult to deal with early on. So I wanted to try to mitigate those issues. So the first way I did that was by adding Dean Thomas, just another copy, just because this is another character that when they play Picking on Neville, he becomes fodder to discard to protect your other cards, and he will already have provided the value that you want from him by giving you the 3 cards. So that was the first include, just adding one more Dean Thomas. In the same vein, Peeves is also an effect. Let me explain Jeeves. So once per game, Jeeves makes it so both players discard their hands and draw 7 cards. And this can be really useful early. If your opponent plays a card like Escaping the Dursleys, that you've seen on other streams, but let me still pull it up. Then in order to solve it, you have to discard your hand. Well, Peeves, but the reward from Escaping the Dursleys is that you can search any card you want from your deck. So when you solve this, you can just search for Peeves and then play him, and then you get a full hand of 7 new cards, which is pretty good. And he can also just be used generally early, especially if you're starting. If you play this on your first turn, you can play, let's say, Seamus Finnigan, discard 2 of your cards, then play Peeves and get a whole new hand of cards. And your opponent will be at 7 cards, so they're not really gaining anything, but you are gaining more cards than you had in your hand. The third thing is that he can be part of your kill combo in this deck. By making your opponent get to 7 cards, you can combine that with Dobbys Help and the Venomous Tentacular Juice to make them draw the rest of the cards in their deck. And you can also use Peeves with 2 Venomous Tentacular Juice to make them draw the rest of the cards in their deck. So really there was no good reason to play a Griphook over Peeves, because Peeves helps just as much with the kill combo, except in one case where you are only playing Dobbys Helps. So if you, let's say you're trying to play 2 Dobbys Help and then use a Griphook, well, with Peeves, you would only be making them draw 27 cards in that scenario. So for all of those reasons, well, the point was that's kind of a niche case, and Peeves helps in most scenarios, so he was definitely useful enough that I think it justifies to have 1 copy of him. He, just like Dean Thomas, can also be a fodder card if they play Picking on Neville. If you already used this effect, you can discard him to protect your other stuff. So those were the first 2 includes. And I also added a card called Muffling Draught, and this is the card that I was worried is potentially a problem. Now, this card requires only 3 power, and it says during your opponent's next turn, he or she can't use actions to play spell cards. Now, you've just seen the card Deboning, which makes it so your opponent can't play any cards, whereas this one only prevents them from playing spell cards. So you might say, well, this doesn't seem that broken. And it might be I find out that it isn't as bad as I think. It's barely been tested, so it's all in the, I guess, theory phase. But the thinking here was that the first thought was that I want to protect against the disruption of the McGonagall deck, because we were having problems against that. So here you could spend 2 actions to develop your board, then play the Muffling Draught to ensure that they cannot mess with your combo for the next turn by preventing them from playing spells. But then I realized that this actually goes way beyond that, because not only does this stop your opponent from disrupting you with spells, but also it stops all of the spell win conditions. And there are so many win conditions in the game that rely on spells, and a lot of interaction with your opponent that relies on playing spells. And Deboning requires 7 power to play, whereas Muffling Draught only requires 3 power to play. And in a so-called normal deck, this card might be not that good, because you're spending a card and an action, and your opponent is not losing the ability to play cards. They can still do things on their turn. But when you're a character deck, you're drawing so many cards that you're likely to see one of these every turn if you play 4 copies. You also have Hannah Abbott in the deck that can get it back from your discard pile. So essentially, you can get very early to a point where you're playing this, as early as having 3 power, and then you can keep playing it every turn. So against decks that rely on spells, this becomes a total lockout and seems really powerful just because of the fact that you can play it so damn early. At just 3 power, that's kind of crazy. And then, yeah, I did some test games of this against a deboning character deck that has not yet been shown on the channel, where because it relies on spells, it would just lose incredibly early as soon as this card was played. Now, of course, in any card game, there will be cases where a card is really good against certain decks. So it might be that, first of all, I haven't tested this enough. So there may be a lot of things that I haven't thought about. First of all, you can disrupt the power of this by messing with Ginny, because if the character decks don't have their draw, then they won't be drawing into their Muffling Draughts constantly. So then you can sort of break free from this trap. Prevent it from happening in the first place, because once they play the first one, then you can't play the disruptive spells anymore, at least if they draw what they're supposed to draw. But the other thing is, there are some ways that you could combat this. Of course, since this only prevents spell cards, you can play creature cards. The reason I didn't find that too convincing is that it still takes some time for the creature cards to finish you off, and creature cards usually rely on the support of spell cards to be good. Like the spell cards delay the game so that the creature cards can finish the game off. But if you're not able to play the spell cards, your opponent just has to survive for enough turns while playing Muffling Draught to be able to pull off their big combo to kill you in one shot, and you're not able to disrupt them enough because you don't have the access to spell cards. So that is a concern. But still, it's something to think about. Perhaps creatures deal with this in some manner. And the other card I thought about was a card that we're actually playing in this deck and that I didn't remove because I realized that this card might be good, is Draco Malfoy. He just allows you to use an action to discard a card from your hand, to look at your opponent's hand and discard a card from theirs. So Muffling Draught doesn't prevent your opponent from playing Draco. So you can play Draco and start discarding the cards that are part of their kill combo. And hopefully that means that even if they keep you in a Muffling Draught lock, they don't have the pieces that they need to kill you. However, that is sort of... I'm not sure that is a reliable way to deal with it, but it's an idea at least. And especially if you're playing a character deck, then you could use Draco 3 times a turn, because you also have the draw of Ginny behind you. So you could really, if they are relying on a few spells like in this deck, Venomous, Tentacular Juice, and Dobbys Help, then you have a means to get rid of all of that stuff. The next thing I thought about is actually a very uncommon card in my decks at this point. I guess none of them play it. It's a card called Put Outer that actually looks really bad. It requires 4 power. It's an item. It says you can use 2 actions to choose one of our opponent's cards in play and return it to his or her hand. But in this particular scenario, imagine where you really need your spells and you're being locked out by Muffling Draught. You can, in a character deck, play this card. And it wouldn't be so bad in matchups where you don't need it, because you have Seamus that can just discard it for more actions. You can play this card, Put Outer, and you can use the 2 actions to put their Ginny back into their hand. So this is all theory, but that would be a way to break out of the lock that might make it so that Muffling Draught is not as much of a problem. Yeah, I think that was my thoughts on the Muffling Draught. So I'm hoping that it's not going to be a huge problem. Of course, when you're playing in a house format, you have full freedom over what cards you want to allow to be played. So if it turns out that the game starts revolving around too much around who plays the Muffling Draught first, that could make the game boring, but then you could ban the card. And that is something I might do on the channel, but it's way too early to make that decision. There needs to be a lot of playtesting first, and it might be that just a really good answer is to just deal with Ginny very early on so that they don't get enough cards to play the Muffling Draught. Perhaps, as I talked about with the Hooch deck, you may play cards like Vanishing Referee. Let me show that one again, to have even more tools against character decks, if you're scared of stuff like this. You might also say that, well, you can only play 4 Muffling Draughts, maybe you don't draw them. With the draw you have, I think it's incredibly likely you can actually build a deck to be able to recycle these very efficiently. That's not really what this deck is doing, but if you wanted to. But there's another reason the argument doesn't hold up, and that's there is a card that does the exact same thing, but it requires 1 more power and does 2 damage to your opponent as well, called Jawbind Potion. So if you really needed more copies, you could actually just put some of these in your deck. So once the lock is rolling, it's not hard to design a deck that keeps it rolling. Of course, you need to keep in mind when designing your deck that if you put too many cards like this in your hand that don't help you establish the board that you need to be able to start playing Muffling Draught, then then those cards will be useless because you won't be able to play them. So too many copies can also be bad. So there's some kind of balance there. There is some deck building decisions about if this card becomes a big thing in my meta, then becomes a question what will you include in your deck to deal with it. Yeah, so I just thought that was an interesting thing. And the first thing I wanted to show on this stream today is if this card actually works as intended versus the McGonagall deck. So yeah, so let's jump into a game where I'm playing the Runs Help deck with Muffling Draught and see if it's enough to make it a favorable matchup against McGonagall. So the first action we play... Oh, actually, I forgot. Peeves discards our own hand. So I actually gotta be careful here. Now I think I remember why maybe Peeves wasn't such a good idea. Oh, wait. I totally messed this up. So, yes, Peeves... we did have a kill, because Peeves does discard our hand, but because we have Hannah Abbott, we know that we can get those cards that we need back from our discard pile. So that was just a mess up by me. So Peeves does make some sense.